So today's video is finally gonna be another serial killer video. I haven't done one of these in like a month. But before I say anything else, thank you so much for 500,000 subscribers. 500,000 subscribers, that is mental. Thank you for just liking my content enough to watch it, never mind click a button to say that you want more of it. Like, that's unreal. But today we're going to be talking about a case that I have wanted to do ever since I started my channel. And like, outside of true crime and everything, I'm really big into like horror films and stuff, and this case has inspired so many horror films, and this case was suggested by one of my channel members named Rebecca Lee, so thank you so much, Rebecca. But before we get into the case, I quickly want to thank 21 Buttons for sponsoring this video. If you follow me on Instagram, you will know I love 21 Buttons. It's essentially kind of like an Instagram where you can post pictures and everything, but you know how sometimes when you're scrolling through Instagram and you see a really cute outfit and you want to know where they got it from but they haven't tagged it? Well, on 21 Buttons, people can link the exact items that are in the picture, so no scrolling through websites and looking for this specific item. You just click a little button on the picture right on, like, say the t-shirt you like, and it'll take you straight to the website to get that t-shirt. I personally love using this app like when I've got an event coming up or a party or something and I have no idea what to wear, I've got no inspiration, I'll go on 21 Buttons and like see what everyone else is wearing. I also save all of my favourite pieces into what's called a wardrobe, and it basically just keeps them all together in a little section, so then when you do want inspiration, they're all in one place and it's easy to find. You'll also find exclusive pictures of all your favourite influencers on there as well, pictures that are on any of their other social medias, so you can shop kind of more exclusive looks. I always post pictures of different like makeup looks I do, so you can shop my eyeshadow palette, my eyelashes, my contact lenses, even my phone case. So if you want to download 21 Buttons, there will be a link in the description. You can follow me. My name's just Eleanor Neale. But yeah, a huge thank you to 21 Buttons for sponsoring this video. I have loved that app for so long. You guys know I've been using it for ages. So yeah, now let's talk serial killers. Quickly, before I get into it, I just want to give my usual disclaimer that I mean absolutely no disrespect to anyone that I talk about in this video. This video is for educational purposes, and everything that I'm about to say is just information that I have found on the internet and I'm compiling into one video. So Edward Theodore Gein, better known to the public as Ed but to his friends as Eddie, was born on August 27th, 1906 in La Crosse County, Wisconsin in the USA. Immediately from birth, Ed was never fully accepted by his parents, Augusta and George Gein, so we'll talk about them a little bit first. His father, George Gein, was orphaned at the age of 3 after he watched his parents and his older sister get swept away in a flash flood and drown right in front of him. After that, he was brought up by his grandparents and he turned to alcohol at a very young age and became addicted and was for the rest of his life. He never got off it. In his mid-20s, George met who would one day become his future wife and the mother of his children, Augusta, and she was a very fierce, dominant, very strict religious woman, and this marriage was an awful pairing. The two of them fell out of love very quickly. Augusta was just so dominant, she ran the whole household because obviously George was too drunk to most of the time, and when he would drink a lot, George would become abusive, physically abusive towards Augusta and then in the future their children. Although Augusta wasn't innocent, she would abuse him back, she would verbally abuse him. She hated her husband and he hated his wife. Although due to Augusta's really strict religious beliefs, she refused to get a divorce, and so the two of them were kind of forced to live in this loveless, toxic marriage for the rest of their lives. In 1902, George and Augusta had their first child, a little boy, Ed's older brother named Henry. Although Augusta really struggled to bond with this little boy, and she probably suffered from a lot of different like postnatal illnesses that weren't diagnosed in the time, and because Augusta struggled to bond with her son so much, she wanted a second child. She wanted a second chance to try again, and she really wanted this second child to be a girl. She felt she might bond better with a girl. In fact, she prayed and begged God every night to bless her with a daughter, but of course that didn't work, and in 1906 the two of them had Ed Gein. At first, Augusta didn't accept him. George was a little bit more accepting, but Augusta felt like Ed and his older brother were a punishment from God. She felt like she'd done something wrong. But Augusta quickly had a change of heart when she realised that now she had 2 little children that she could brainwash and mould into her ideal human beings to follow all of her beliefs. At this point, she didn't really care if they were a boy or a girl. She just wanted someone to control. Augusta hated women. All women apart from herself. She said that all women are born harlots apart from her. But she also equally hated men. She felt that they were all foul-mouthed and they used women for sex. And I think at some point she had this realization that she now had two little boys that she could raise into respectable men in her eyes. So for the first 8 years of Ed's life, the family lived in La Crosse County. His parents owned a grocery store and the household was ruled by Augusta. Although eventually Augusta grew to hate La Crosse County, the area that they were living in. She felt like everyone living there was hypersexual, they were all sinners, and obviously she was trying to raise her son to be these perfect God-honouring men. She couldn't have them growing up in this town and being corrupted. She couldn't allow them to be corrupted by any town for that matter. And so the family sold their grocery store and they went and bought a really isolated farmhouse located in what's known as the Great Dead Heart of Wisconsin. And when I say isolated, this farmhouse was miles away from the nearest town. The nearest town was called Plainfield, and even then Plainfield was a very small town. The population never really exceeded 700 people. Ed and his brother Henry were only ever allowed to leave this farmhouse to go to school every day, but even then they weren't allowed to talk to other children. And while at school, Ed would never really talk to anyone. Obviously, he was too scared of what his mother might do when she found out. However, he would sit in the back of the class and just randomly burst out into maniacal laughter. And pretty quickly, Ed Gein started being bullied at school because he was physically different. He had a droopy eye, he had a wonky smile, he had a very kind of effeminate manner. Like I said, their father George was an alcoholic all his life, so he never really had an active part in the boys' childhood or raising the boys at all. But Augusta liked it that way. She had more control over the boys. She could brainwash them easier if there wasn't someone else trying to raise them as well. George would beat the boys as well as Augusta when he got super drunk. Augusta would smother the boys, but not in a loving way, just more in a everything is a lesson, you always have to be learning. Like, she wasn't an affectionate mother at all. And Ed grew a kind of love-hate vision of his mother. He always wanted to impress her and prove himself to her and prove that he was a good boy that she'd raised, but she was always just constantly tearing him down. Ed was never good enough, and so he loved her on the surface, but deep down he resented her. And this isolated farmhouse where they all lived has been described by psychologists as a breeding ground of psychopathology and an incubation place for madness, because it was so isolated yet so intense at the same time. At age 14, Ed Gein decided to leave school to work full-time on this farm, and then it was total isolation. Now he didn't have any human contact apart from his tiny, radicalized family. Although years later, when they were in like their 30s, the boys, Henry and Ed, began taking like odd jobs in the town of Plainfield. And both boys had a reputation for being very hardworking, very trustworthy, just very good workers. Someone was quoted saying, "With Eddie, you pay him $1, you get $1.50 work out of him." And this was also around the time of the Second World War. However, neither of the boys really had anything to do with it. Henry was too old and Ed actually failed his physical exams because of his droopy eye. His vision was kind of impaired. And when Ed hit his early 30s, his father George was very ill with his alcoholism. Like, his organs began to pack in and he needed constant care from all of his family. After 3 years of constant care from the family that had grown to resent him, Ed's father passed away when Ed was 34 in 1940, aged 66. And the boys and Augusta weren't heartbroken at all. They were more relieved that they didn't have to look after this man anymore because none of them liked him. After the passing of their father, Henry and Ed began to pick up more odd jobs in the town. That was kind of when they started working them a little bit more. And Henry actually, through one of these jobs, met a single mother and began dating her. And this was the first woman that Henry had ever had any kind of human contact with, other than the girls when he was in school and his own mother. he'd never spoken to a woman at all before. And this, speaking with another woman from the outside world, really opened up Henry's eyes to how radicalised and insane his mother was. He began rejecting Augusta's views, he began finally standing up for himself after all these years, and so Augusta began favouring Ed Gein, the boy that was constantly trying to prove himself to her. Henry would make fun of Ed for his really close relationship with his mother. He would make fun of Ed for his kind of aversion and phobia of sex and of women, something that his mother had taught him. Like I said, Henry began disagreeing with and defying Augusta, and he would speak ill of her when he was with Ed, and Ed didn't like that at all. And then on May 16th, 1944, while Ed and Henry were outside in the garden of the farmhouse, a fire broke out, although it's never been confirmed how this fire started. All we know is that this fire broke out at the farmhouse. Ed went and got some help from police and firemen, and when they returned and the fire was put out, Ed was able to lead police and firemen straight to his brother Henry's dead body. Somehow he knew he was dead and exactly where he was as well. Ed claimed that Henry was the one that started the fire that day, and the wind just kind of blew it out of control, and obviously it was an accidental death by that story. When Henry's body was found, he was laid face down in the dirt, stretched out, and he was completely untouched by the fire. There wasn't a single burn on this man. Though he did have some unexplained bruising and blood on his head, which to any normal person, when paired with the fact that his brother led them straight to his body and that he was untouched by the flames, to me, that says that Ed maybe had a hand in this. Not to mention the recent change in the family dynamic, the fact that Henry had suddenly started going against the mother that Ed worshipped. But the police felt that the Gein family had already gone through enough. They'd just lost their father and now they've lost a brother, and so they just kind of ruled it as an accidental death. There was no autopsy performed on Henry, and they just ruled it as death from asphyxiation. They also believed that maybe like the smoke made him pass out, and then maybe he hit his head on the ground and that's how he got those marks. Although in retrospect of the crimes that Ed Gein would go on to commit in the future, researchers are pretty certain that it was not an accident, and a lot of people think that maybe Ed Gein's first victim was his own brother. And just like when George died, Ed and Augusta weren't really that heartbroken. Augusta still had her favourite son, and Ed now had his mother all to himself. But that happiness didn't last very long. Just a couple of months after George passed away, Augusta suffered a stroke which left her partially paralysed. And this meant that Ed Gein had to be her full-time carer, but he didn't mind. He was, like I said, eager to prove himself. He really wanted to show his mum how good of a son he was. And he nursed her pretty much back to health. Like I said, she was partially paralysed, but she was mobile again, and she never really showed him any kind of affection or gratitude for doing that for her. And after that, life just kind of carried on as it always had, with Ed never being good enough for Augusta. In the winter of 1945, Ed and Augusta went to visit a local farm, some people that they were kind of friends with, a guy named Smith. They went to go and buy some straw. And while they were there, for whatever reason, the farmer started beating his dog to death. This was a completely different time. I don't know what the hell went on. And as he was doing so, a woman ran out of the house and began pleading with him to stop hurting this dog. Now, this woman wasn't Smith's wife, but she was kind of like his girlfriend or whatever. And just the sight of this woman triggered Augusta so much. Remember, she hated women. Women that weren't married or owned by a man. Women that were sexual in any form. And for this woman to be in Smith's house and not married to him, Augusta was disgusted. Augusta began screaming, saying that this woman was Smith's harlot, and Ed had to actually take her home because she was so angry. And this whole situation actually triggered a second, this time fatal, stroke in Augusta. She died December 29th, 1945, aged 67, leaving her son, Ed Gein, alone in the world. Everything that Ed had ever known was ripped from him in that moment. For the last 40 years, he had lived by his mother's rules. He didn't have his own life. His life was his mother's life. And without Augusta, Ed had nothing. He was nothing without his mother. At her funeral, he was sobbing and wailing uncontrollably like a child would be at their mother's funeral. With Augusta, Ed's life died too. She'd trained him almost to be scared of human contact, particularly women. And psychologists believe that when Augusta died, Ed fell into some sort of psychosis. And he dealt with this in the weirdest of ways. So, as you know, they had this huge farmhouse. It was really quite big. It had a lot of land. And he decided to board up every single room apart from the kitchen and a tiny little room coming off it. He wanted the whole house to stay as his mother left it, and so he never stepped foot in any other room in his house ever again. It all just stayed Augusta's. And so now Ed was living in this tiny little bedroom off of the kitchen, and it was a mess. It was filthy, it was cluttered. Ed himself became filthy and unhygienic. He stopped shaving, he looked very tatty, he didn't dress himself very well. After his mother passed, Ed began going into the town of Plainfield a little bit more often, still not very often, and he would frequent this tavern owned by a woman named Mary Hogan. And Ed liked Mary Hogan because she kind of reminded him of his mother. She was a short, stocky woman, she was loud, she was dominant, like he saw his mother in her. And so he would often go into this tavern just to see Mary, just to sit and stare at her. And that is kind of creepy, but Mary understood why he did it, and so she didn't have too much of a problem with it. He began taking odd jobs around the town again, including babysitting for the townspeople's children. He seemed to kind of relate to children a lot more than other adults, probably because he never had a childhood of his own. And the townspeople considered Ed to be very weird, but not like in a scary way, just more of an odd person. Like, they described him as harmless, but still very weird. He became a victim of what would now be called bullying. Back then they just thought they were teasing him, but he was bullied by other people in the town, specifically other kind of farmers that he would trade with. He was an easy target. There were a lot of things that they could pick on about Ed Gein, his physical appearance and his weird traits, and he never really fought back. Like I said, he began taking a few more odd jobs in the town, and the women would often take the men lunch while they were working. And when they would, the women said that they would feel very uncomfortable around Ed Gein because he would stare a lot. Like, they understood the reason he was doing it because he'd never had a girlfriend before, he'd never had sex before. Like, women were a very foreign thing to him. He was cooped up on a little farmhouse, the only woman being his mother. And as the years went by, Ed became more accustomed to being alone in this big farmhouse. Well, it wasn't really that big because he only allowed himself these two filthy, cluttered rooms. And he began picking up a few more hobbies. He would read comic books and magazines, almost always to do with horror. He would read about a lot of true crime, a lot of like the current happenings in the world. Like I said, it was World War II time, and so in the newspapers there were a lot of pictures of like concentration camps and things, and he would love reading about that. He was particularly interested in stories about cannibalism and sexual mutilation and grave robbing, and he would read the obituaries just for fun. But of course these were things that he would do when he was in his home alone, so no one knew that this was going on behind the scenes of this kind of weird but harmless man. And then one afternoon in May of 1947, an 8-year-old girl named Georgia Wacker disappeared from the town of Plainfield. She was dropped off close to her house by a neighbour, not exactly at her house, so she still had to walk a little bit, but she never returned home. And so obviously a lot of rumours were going around about like kidnap and murder. Searches did take place to find Georgia, but she was never seen again. And over the next 5 years, 4 more people from Plainfield went missing in equally as unexplained ways. Evelyn Hartley, a teenage girl who babysat local kids, went missing in 1953. and all that was ever found of her were some blood-stained clothes. 2 men also went missing after leaving a local bar, Victor Travis and Ray Burks. However, nothing of those 2 men was ever seen again. Then on December 8th, 1954, local tavern owner Mary Hogan, the woman that resembled Ed's mother, also went missing. A local farmer was visiting the tavern that day to go and pick up some ice cream for his daughter, and as soon as he walked in, he knew that something was wrong. There was money on the floor, there were bullet casings on the floor, and there was blood everywhere. Yet there was no sign of Mary. He called police, who quickly began a full investigation of this disappearance. They followed what very few leads they had, but ultimately there was no real evidence to say where she was, what had happened to her. For 3 years, Mary's disappearance remained unsolved, and because she was such a big character in the town, she was such a big part of the town, everyone still talked about her quite often. One time they were all sat in the tavern and someone said, you know, I wonder where Mary actually is. To which Ed said, oh, she's not missing, she's back at my farmhouse. And everyone laughed because those were the kind of weird jokes that Ed would make, the weird remarks he would come out with. In fact, he once went up to Mary before she was missing while she was working. He went up and cut her apron strings and told her to go home and enjoy her Christmas because it might be her last. And that was just Ed's dark sense of humour. To be fair, at that time a lot of people had a dark sense of humour, which you'll see a little bit more in this case. Then on November 16th, 1957, a 9-day deer hunting event was happening in that area, and this was an annual thing. It happened every year. It was a massive event. For 9 days, all the men would go out and hunt deer competitively all through the day, while all the women remained at home in the town just running things themselves. And Ed wasn't really one to go hunting, and so he stayed at home as well. And all throughout this event, the men would keep coming home at the end of every day, obviously, but they would keep nipping back into town to go and pick some things up, pick some food up, pick some supplies up. And around midday that day, a small crowd began to gather around the hardware store in town, men coming back for bullets and things, but the door was locked, and it was never normally locked. The store was owned by 58-year-old widow Bernice Warden, and no one had seen her all morning. She hadn't been in her hardware store, no one had been in the hardware store actually. Eventually her son returned home from deer hunting around 5 p.m. that evening, and he unlocked the door to the hardware store wondering where his mother was. And as soon as he walked in, he noticed that the shop was in total disarray. And then he saw a trail of blood on the floor, and so he called the police immediately. As police were on their way, he decided to go and check the receipt book to see if the store was open at all that morning, to see if his mother had been working at all that day, or if she'd just never turned up. But the store had been open that morning, and his mother had been making sales, the last of which was for a gallon of antifreeze. And immediately when her son read that receipt, he knew exactly who had done this to his mother. Just the day before, Ed Gein had been into the hardware store and inquired about the price of antifreeze because he wanted to buy some, but he didn't have any money on him that day. So he was just asking how much it was, and then he said he would be back tomorrow to buy it. And so Bernice Warden's son told the police he's done something to her, and panic begun in the town as police raced to Ed's farmhouse. They quickly realised that Ed wasn't home in the farmhouse, and so half of them went to go and find Ed while half of them searched the home, and we'll talk about the home in a second. Eventually the other half of the police ended up finding him. I don't actually know where they found him because I found so many conflicting sources on that. Some say he was in a grocery store, some say that he was just on the street, some say that he was at a car repair shop. I have no idea, but they found him, arrested him, and took him to the police station. Meanwhile, his home was being searched. Now, I just want to give a little bit of a warning here. It is going to start to get very, very graphic. So if you don't like graphic things, skip to this time when we've finished talking about the contents of his home. Inside, it was dark, it was smelly, it was a complete mess. There were things all over the floor. And so as the officers were walking around, they were kind of shining their torches at the floor so that they didn't trip over anything. And as one of the officers walked in through the door, he felt something brush against his shoulder. And so he turned and shone this flashlight on this thing that had just brushed up against his shoulder, and there he saw the dead body of Bernice Warden hung up from the rafters by her feet. She'd been decapitated hollowed out, gutted and cleaned inside, and then hung up by her ankles from the rafters. And as soon as he saw that, this officer ran straight outside and threw up, understandably, because that is one of the most awful things I've ever heard in a case ever. And you guys know I've covered a lot of gruesome stuff, but that is one of the worst things I've ever heard in a case. So before we get into the other super gruesome stuff, I want to talk about some things that police found that were just more creepy and weird to have in your house, but not really gruesome. This man had about 4 or 5 pairs of dentures, yellow teeth dentures, just sat on a shelf like ornaments. He had a bunch of magazine clippings all over this house, or the 2 rooms that he allowed himself to live in, full of like true crime cases, cannibalism, grave robbings, just little cutouts of obituaries. He also had a jar full of chewed up chewing gum. And I don't know whose chewing gum that was, whether it was his own or other chewing gum that he'd found. Now, as for the rest of Bernice Warden's body, her intestines were found wrapped up inside a men's suit, and her heart was found in a plastic bag on the floor in front of a stove. One of the officers found a burlap sack, and when he opened it, steam came out of it, and inside there was Bernice Warden's head. But not just her head, as if he'd like cut it off and put it inside this bag. He'd actually messed with it. He put 2 nails in both of her ears and bent them so that they were more like hooks, and then he attached a rope from one to the other so that this head could be hung up like a decoration. Another officer found a paper bag, and when he opened it, he found a clump of hair. And so he pulled out this clump of hair, and as he did, a full face came out with it. It was still attached to a face. Not a head, just the face, just the skin off the face, and one of the officers recognised that face as Mary Hogan. So now I'm just going to kind of list the rest of the things that police found in this house, because there is a lot. There are pictures of some of them online. Some of the pictures that you'll come across are from like movie reenactments, so don't believe like every picture you see. But there are a lot of pictures online of this stuff, because reporters will let into the room straight away, and that would never happen now. But what I'm saying is, I'm not really going to be putting many pictures in for obvious reasons, because it is gross. But if you do want to see that, then you can look online, because I know what you guys are like. I might include a couple of pictures, like the less gory ones, I don't know. But anyway, police found 4 chairs upholstered in human flesh. They also found lampshades made of human skin, including faces. They found whole human bones and fragments stored inside a storage basket that was made of human skin. There were skulls on Ed's bedpost that he put there as decoration. There were also some other skulls with the tops sawn off so that he could use them as bowls to eat out of. Police found a shoebox containing the genitals of 9 different women, one of which Ed had even painted silver and put a little red bow on it. Another box had 4 noses in it, and a disused cereal box contained scraps of human head skin. His coffee table was propped up using human shin bones. He fashioned the drawstring on one of his window shades to have a pair of human lips as a puller. Police also found a further 2 sets of female genitals believed to have been from girls around the age of 15, as well as a dress believed to belong to another young girl around that same age. They found a tray of female fingernails, as well as human face masks, female faces that Gein sometimes dressed up in. He also fashioned clothes from his victim's skin, including an apron, gloves, leggings made of women's leg skin, and a belt made of female nipples. He also made an entire waistcoat from the whole torso skin of a woman, breasts and all, that he called his mammary vest. Ed Gein admitted that he would often dress up as a woman ever since his mother passed away. Some people say that he wanted a sex change, he wanted to become female. Other people say that he just wanted to dress up as a female. I don't know what Ed himself said about the situation, but a lot of psychologists believe that he was either dressing up as his mother or dressing up as a girl to feel more like something that his mother would have wanted. Because if you remember, his mother always wanted a girl, and she always told the boys that as well. She told the boys that they weren't what she wanted a girl. And other psychologists believe that he just had a fascination with the female body because his mother taught him to be scared of it all his life, and he'd never had any kind of sexual contact with a woman. Psychologists believe it might have manifested itself in such a horrific way. He would treat the female face masks with motor oil to keep the skin kind of supple, kind of like a moisturizer, and he would put lipstick on the lips. He would put the face mask on, put this mammary vest on with breasts on it, and sometimes even stick the female genitals to himself, and then just go and stand in front of a mirror and just look like a woman. So as this search was going on around Ed Gein's home, as they were recovering all these body parts, he was still being questioned at the police station. And this was a huge nationwide story. It was being covered in People magazine, it was being covered in Time magazine, and reporters, like I said, were going straight inside the house and taking pictures of everything before it was all recovered. Everyone knew about the Ed Gein case. Everyone had read the articles, everyone had seen the pictures, and very quickly something known as Gein humour began. And this was very, very dark humour about Ed's crimes and his possessions and what he would do to these people.
Well, I believe that the jokes sort of was an outlet for how everyone felt and the fear that they felt.
One of them was, what was Ed's favorite dessert? And he says, lady fingers.
Ed Gein gave his girlfriend a present on Valentine's Day. It was a box of farmers' fannies, you know.
There were actually people thrown out of the restaurant in Plainfield for going and ordering Gein burgers and things.
For the first 13 hours that police had Ed Gein back at the police station, he refused to speak to investigators. He refused to speak to anyone, really. They then confronted him about the fact that they'd found and recovered Bernice Warden's body, the body that was hanging from the rafters. And I think at that point he just realised that there was no point in staying quiet. He might as well tell his story. He agreed to cooperate and speak to police, but only on one condition, that he was given a slice of apple pie with cheese on it. And so police went and got him it, and as soon as he ate it, he told police anything they wanted to know. So police's first set of questions were obviously, what are all these body parts? Who do they belong to? Did you kill the people that all these body parts belong to? And surprisingly, Ed Gein's answer was no. He didn't kill all the people that these bodies belonged to. He killed some, but not all. It took him a while, but he eventually admitted to killing Mary Hogan and Bernice Warden, the two women that looked eerily similar to his mother, Augusta. But then he said that the rest of the body parts were from bodies that were already dead when he found them. Ed claimed that obviously he would regularly read the obituaries, we knew that, but he would keep an eye on them, and whenever a middle-aged woman that was kind of around his mum's age would die, he would wait until the night of her funeral when she's just been buried, and then he would go and dig up her grave during the night. Some of these were women that he knew, some of them he'd never met before, but he would go and dig up their coffin, take out their body, and then rebury the empty coffin. He said he did this as many as 40 times. He would go to the cemetery in a dazed-like state, and 30 of these 40 times he actually snapped out of it and went home empty-handed. But around 9-10 times he actually went through with it and dug up a body. So obviously police needed some kind of proof that this was true, because they can't charge him for murders that he didn't commit. Like, yes, he's committed a crime taking these bodies out of the ground, but he didn't kill them. So Ed took police to two of the specific graves that he dug up, and police re-exhumed these bodies to see if his stories were true, if there were still bodies in there, or if he'd taken them. And when they were both opened, they were both pretty much empty. One of them had a crowbar in it, which seemed to align up with Ed Gein's story that he obviously opened the coffin. So it's believed that he just kind of replaced the body with his crowbar by accident, forgot to take it home with him. And the other coffin was empty, but on top of the coffin, underneath the mud, there were human bones found. So it's believed that he took this body, he took the parts he needed, and then took some of the bones back to the grave, but didn't bother putting them back in the coffin, just kind of buried them on top of it. Ed also led the police to the remains of Mary Hogan's body because, like I said, they only found her head, like her face. So the rest of her body he actually cut up and cremated. He said he had no use for the rest of her body, which I don't understand because he seemed to find uses for anything and everything, but for some reason he burnt the rest of her body. Ed Gein denies ever engaging in cannibalism or necrophilia with these bodies. He said he simply just wanted them for their bodies, no other use. And psychologists believe him. Psychologists believe that he genuinely only wanted their body parts. For whatever weird reason, he wanted to do all these things and keep gloves of human hands and lampshades of human skin. They believe that's all he wanted. So if you remember, we talked about those 4 disappearances before Mary Hogan's. There was 8-year-old Georgia, Evelyn, the babysitter, and those 2 men. Now, Ed Gein has never officially been connected to those 4 disappearances, although a lot of people believe he might be responsible for them. However, my own personal opinion, I don't put my own opinions in often, but I just wonder what use he had for the men, because a lot of psychologists believe that he did all this because of his mother, like he wanted his mother back, so he wanted to dress up as a woman, he wanted women's body parts. What use would he have with 2 men, you know? I believe that he probably could be responsible for Georgia and Evelyn, whereas the other 2 men, I feel like, as well, Ed Gein was quite a small, skinny man, so how he could overpower 2 men, I don't know. Let me know what you think in the comments below. There's no official connection, although a lot of people believe he is responsible for all 4 of those. So now police had confessions from Ed Gein and they had evidence to support these confessions. They knew he was telling the truth. And so they decided to send him to a mental hospital to be assessed to see if he was criminally insane or not. Ed Gein's official diagnosis was schizophrenic personality with neurotic manifestations, making him not criminally responsible for his crimes. He was found not guilty by reason of insanity and sent to live the rest of his life in a mental hospital.
I looked at Ed, and he looked at me, and I could see he was nervous. He was fearful. And he says to me, "What are they going to do to me? What are they going to do to me?" So the judge raps everybody to be quiet. And I had my hand down on the bench here, and he's next to me, and he reaches over and grabs my hand like I was his mother or something.
And there at the hospital, Ed was regarded as a model patient. He kept to himself, he was well behaved, he never caused any problems, he was a good patient. Although it has been said by other patients at this hospital that during a full moon you would get glimpses of the psychotic Ed underneath this kind of normal Ed. He would talk about women and what he would do to their bodies after he found them dead or after he killed them. He would talk about things that he would make with them. And then these patients say that once the full moon went, Ed was fine again, and he was this model patient again. While Ed Gein was in hospital, the state decided to auction off all of his belongings, his house, his car, all of his kind of major possessions that were just destroyed, so that they could pay for lawsuits for the victims' families, funeral costs and things like that. And these auctions had been advertised for a while. They were an anticipated event. Everyone was waiting for this auction. But during the night before the auction, Ed Gein's farmhouse was mysteriously burnt down.
I went to Ed's room and I told him that his house had burned down. And he made a gesture just as well, the exact words that he said.
The cause of the fire actually remains unsolved to this day. Police obviously believe it probably wasn't accidental. Police believe that someone started this fire on purpose, but who and for what reason, we don't know.
The people in Playwood were so happy that this house burned down and this was going to go away. We weren't going to be bombarded by the media. We were not going to be having tourists come to Plainfield to see Ed Gein's horror house.
Ed's car, however, was completely untouched. That was fine, and it was actually auctioned off and sold to a man that ran a circus. And this man turned Ed Gein's car into a very dark tourist attraction. He would charge people 25 cents to come and look at the car, and on his first viewing he had over 2,000 people come. Meanwhile, in hospital, Ed was doing very well. He was one of the only patients in this whole hospital that didn't require medication to behave, he wouldn't act out or anything, but he was also the only patient in the whole hospital that was denied any access to the outside world. No one was allowed in, he wasn't allowed visitors, he wasn't allowed out, which meant that there was never really any interviews with Ed Gein. He did, however, have a lot of admirers, a lot of women that would send him love letters and want to marry him, request locks of his hair. After 10 years in this hospital, Ed Gein's doctors said that he was better now mentally and he was fit to stand trial, and so he did. And then he was officially found guilty of all of his crimes, but because he was mentally unwell at the time, they couldn't give him any prison time, and so he was just sent back to the hospital for the rest of his life. Edward Theodore Gein passed away in hospital on July 26, 1984 at the age of 77 after suffering with lung cancer and respiratory failure. And his place of rest is the exact same graveyard that he would go and dig up his victims from. The same graveyard that he'd been to over 40 times. And his exact grave is actually between his mother Augusta's and his brother Henry's grave. Of course, as I'm sure you know, and as I said right in the beginning of the video, Ed Gein's case has inspired a lot of famous horror films. Norman Bates in Psycho, Leatherface in Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Buffalo Bill in The Silence of the Lambs, among many others. Like I said, season 2 of American Horror Story, Asylum, Dr. Oliver Thredson is based on Ed Gein. There's a lot of songs about him. There's a Slayer song about him called Dead Skin Mask, I think it's called. Yeah, one of the most famous serial killer cases in the world, and I have wanted to cover this for the longest time, so thank you so much, Rebecca Lee, again. But yeah, thank you so much for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed. Again, a huge thank you to 21 Buttons for sponsoring this video. If you want to download it, the link is in the description. And just before I go, I just want to let you know that I have a second channel. I know I'm a bit rubbish at uploading on it, but I have it. And I'm going to start uploading on it again soon. So if you want to subscribe, I'll link it up here and it'll also be on the end card. If you want to see a little bit more of, like, Eleanor, like the person behind these scary videos, then go and subscribe to that. We have fun on that channel. I'm also thinking about moving my makeup videos onto the second channel. I still haven't decided yet. Let me know your feedback. Do you want them to stay on the main channel or move to the second one? I don't know. But yeah, thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed, make sure you leave a big thumbs up and subscribe down below if you want to see some more from me, because I do scary, spooky videos like this all the time. A big shout out to all of my channel members. All of their names are on screen right now. If you want to become a channel member, all you have to do is click the link in my description, or you can click the join button if you're on a desktop. If you do become a channel member, you get access to a bunch of extra perks. You get your name on this end screen of every single video. You'll also get access to a members only community tab where we talk about the cases. I'll ask for case suggestions. You'll get your suggestions fast tracked. But yeah, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you. Oh, just hit myself in the face. And I will see you in the next one. Bye.